Northwest Scotland has a really classic geology, and in the middle of the 19th century it was thought to hold the key to unlocking a significant part of British stratigraphy. It didn't. What happened, through a space of geological fieldwork and some pretty vigorous arguments, was that it became known for providing insights into the tectonic processes of mountain building, a very different topic. So why do we need to understand the history of the geological discoveries of Northwest Scotland? Well, they're interesting in their own right, but actually by studying the history of geology, we can understand where the ideas come from, and particularly how we build the interpretation of geological relationships. And we can use those lessons to understand the limitations and the challenges of interpretation, and we can apply those to our own endeavours today. So let's see how this plays out. So this is a history, and one of great argument. It's a history that straddles some of the earliest work in geology anywhere, from the 1830s through to the end of the 19th century, involving a whole series of important players in their day and a change in how the science was done. So let's go back in time to the first investigations and the earliest geological map of Scotland, which was drawn by John McCulloch. So here's McCulloch's map, and here's John McCulloch. The map was published after his death, but it was the work of him and him alone, walking and investigating this, what at the time was pretty remote and inaccessible ground. The base map onto which the geology is drawn is very simplified and inaccurate in many places, so just making a map alone is a pretty dramatic effort. So what does it show? Well, the ground in the middle here, through the central part, he recognised were gneisses or various types of metamorphic rock. And in the early part of the 19th century, the belief was that these metamorphic rocks dated from early parts of Earth history and were generally all considered to be old. So he also recognised that there were younger rocks or sedimentary rocks on either side of this central belt, a ground on the east which contains the Old Red Sandstone, and some rather similar looking rocks called the Torridonian out in the west. And so he thought that the metamorphic rocks were fringed by sedimentary, and the succession was essentially a large dome. So in the following debates that challenged McCulloch's work, the critical ground was in the Northwest Highlands, in the area marked by the red box, and that's really where we're going to be considering the geology in this presentation. So the game moves on now to James Nicol into the middle part of the 19th century, and he was wanting to establish the stratigraphic order. So here's Nicol. He was the first professor of natural history in the Consolidated University of Aberdeen, and looking pretty wild there. And he created also his own geological map, building on the work of McCulloch, and here it is, published in 1858. And Nicol did a lot of work in the western part of this map, quite near the town of Ullapool, and here is his cross-section through there. And what he found was that the metamorphic rocks, which were generally termed the upper gneiss, lay actually on top of the sedimentary rocks in this part of Scotland. Let's go and have a look at some of these places. So here's it's a famous place today, and it was an important place for Nicol in the 1850s. He recognised a rock succession of sedimentary rocks, quartzites, so-called fucoid beds of limestone, and then what we now know as the Moine, he refers to as the upper gneiss, sitting there on the top of the hillside. And here's his cross-section through there. We're looking front onto it, so not side-on as in the cross-section. And he considered the contacts between the upper gneiss and the sedimentary rocks not to be a simple stratigraphic succession, but actually to be faulted. And he marked the fault. On his cross-section, he considered it to include some igneous rocks intruded along the fault plane, but that's how he interpreted the geology. Right, so the next guy on the scene that we're going to consider is Roderick Impey Murchison. Now, Murchison's a very different sort of character. Here he is. In a sketch, Murchison is the definition of establishment. He was the second Director General of the Geological Survey of Great Britain, and a man really to be considered. He too made his geological map, published a year after Nicol. You can see that Murchison had a high regard for himself. The biggest lettering on the map is his name and his bold statement that he's the Director General of the Geological Survey. So not a map to be trifled with. It's significantly less detailed than Nicol's, but has the virtue of trying to join things up and show how rock units work through the whole of this region. So Murchison had a very simple idea, which was that rock sequences in northern Scotland, and certainly on the west side, formed a simple stratigraphic succession. This is his diagram. Let's simplify it a bit and add some colour. The Laurentian on the western side is, we would now know this is the Lewisian, is metamorphic, and then we've got various sedimentary cover sequences underneath the hill of Sullivan, through Assynt and out to Ben More, passing from these brown so-called Cambrian, we now know these as Torridonian, on through other sedimentary rocks, and the gneiss rocks sitting on top as a simple stratigraphic succession, getting younger progressively as you move from west to east, culminating in the Old Red Sandstone in Caithness. So we have a controversy. It was a really vehement controversy in the late 1850s. Nicol on one side saying the succession was faulted, that the metamorphic rocks that lay on top were actually faulted on top, and Murchison who said that the succession was continuous. Well, how does that resolve itself? Enter Archie Geekie. He's our next geologist. And here he is with Murchison. Geekie is one of the most decorated geologists of all time in British in British science. He was twice the president of the Geological Society, and he's the only geologist ever to be president of the Royal Society. But he enters our story rather younger. So here he is in his early days, age 25, about to embark on a voyage of discovery as Murchison's field guy. Murchison at the time was in his late 60s. The challenge was to try and sort out the geology and trace the Murchison ideas through the rest of the Northern Highlands in terrain like you can see here, the Fisherfield Wilderness. It's still remote country today, and Geekie traipsed through this ground essentially on a rapid tour, trying to confirm the Murchison hypothesis of stratigraphic continuity. So here's the plan. It was in 1860. It was to do rapid transects to see the really obvious outcrops and to confirm the model. So here's Geekie's notebook sketch and a view of that hillside that he sketched, although to be fair, he drew up his notes the following day, having walked quickly through the ground. And what it shows is metamorphic rocks, which forms the high skyline, sitting on top of the layered sedimentary rocks that form those big slabs on the right of the photograph. He also went to the same site that Nicol went to at Knockan, and also saw a stratigraphic succession. There's his notebook sketch, and the sketch underneath is the diagram that appeared in the publication that he wrote with Murchison the following year. So let's look at the published version, and it shows a rock sequence with those various letters. The rock on top underneath Craig and Knockan is the metamorphic rocks, and they just consider this to be a simple stratigraphy. They go beyond that in the paper, though, and say this, that Nicol had been misled by assigning too great an importance to what that's Murchison, considered to be local and partial disturbances only, and that his interpretations are either erroneous or founded on deceptive local appearances. In other words, Nicol was misled by complexity that didn't really matter when you looked at the regional scale, just some little local tweaks and faults. They didn't try and explain the metamorphism. Sedimentary rocks pass up into metamorphic rocks in this simple stratigraphic sequence. Now that's a bit of a puzzle. But Murchison wasn't really that worried about it. At the time, there wasn't really that much of a theory of metamorphism. People just thought it was essentially formed by contact metamorphism against igneous rocks and just local heating. So Murchison just thought there might have been some igneous rocks just under the surface that had cooked the sediments of his upper gneiss. And the section in northern Scotland became his type area for the Silurian, a continuous section from the Cambrian up through into the Silurian, and it featured in his memoir Siluria, and he held the day. You can see why if you look at how he's referred to himself on the title pages. There he lists his name, all the various qualifications and accolades that he's received in his career. So he's using his status to supplement and support his geological interpretation. Not surprisingly, Murchison won, and he was given an added bonus on that after his death, in that Geekie, his accomplice, essentially succeeded him first as the director of the Geological Survey in Scotland, and here he is sitting with his colleagues. So Murchison's ideas were taken into the geological maps of the day. Here is the compilation that Geekie put together in 1876, showing essentially the base map is better, the detail is better in terms of where the boundaries go, but he shows essentially the Murchison idea that the geology passes as a simple stratigraphic sequence, old in the west, getting progressively younger towards the east, and they gloss over the idea that metamorphic rocks are on top. Well, sitting in that room are a couple of other people in the time. We'll come to these guys later, John Horn and Ben Peach, and they'll feature later in this story. So the story now moves on. It moves on very slowly. So the next people on the scene, Charles Callaway, is going to appear in the early 1880s, some 20 years after apparently the Highland controversy was concluded. Here's Charles Callaway. He was a museum curator, he was a recognised geologist, and had published a bunch of stuff, and he took on the challenge to understand what was going on in the Northern Highlands. In the meantime, access had improved a lot. There were railways to places like Inverness and so forth, so you could get up to the area much more easily than you could in the middle part of that century. And he discovered this. On this view, we'll look at his cross-section in a minute, but he wrote this: by a powerful lateral thrust from the east, the Caledonian, what we now call the Moine, or Murchison referred to as the upper gneiss, was forced up beyond the fault so as to double back the Ascent rocks, the Cambrian, and to overlie them for some distance. So let's look at his cross-section. There is the boxed area as the view we're looking at, and it's probably easy if we add some colour because it's not easy to see what he's saying. So he's saying that what we've coloured up here as red are metamorphic rocks, and they've been carried up on top of the sedimentary rocks by a fault. So there's no way that's a simple stratigraphic succession. It's a tectonised, stacked up succession. It's tectonics, not stratigraphy, that explains many of the rock relationships that we see in northern Scotland. Next up, we have the guy who's generally seen as the hero of the piece, Charles Lapworth. So he and Callaway are going to challenge the Geekie idea. So here's Charles Lapworth. Well, Lapworth had, in 1880, had just become a professor of Mason's College in Birmingham, the forerunner of the University of Birmingham. He got that position largely on the strength of the thoroughness of his work in the southern uplands of Scotland, where he'd applied some really rigorous paleontology stratigraphy, looking at fossil assemblages to develop a proper stratigraphy that he was then able to map out, and in doing so basically trashed the mapping of the Geological Survey, which was largely been looked after by Geekie. So he and Geekie had run into each other before. Lapworth went to the far north of Scotland, up here on the north coast that you can see on the top photograph, and in 1882 and 83, to try and take on the Highlands controversy and reopen it again. He stayed in this cottage at the bottom here, in Heelan Cottage, a shepherd's cottage on the north coast, and mapped the ground that we can see there. The key word is that he mapped it. So here is his field slip. It's a bit scruffy, but it shows continuity of boundaries and builds a three-dimensional understanding of how the rock sequences relate to one another. And he found this outcrop. This is Lapworth's key outcrop. It's at Ben Arnavol, one of the most important outcrops in structural geology anywhere on the planet. And it's these metamorphic rocks thrust on top of sedimentary, gneisses on top of quartz sandstones, and there's the contact running through the middle of the cliff. Clearly a tectonic contact. So what happens next? Well, Geekie didn't take this lying down. He went up there in 1884 to try and see what was going on, not expecting to be proven wrong. He expected the Murchison doctrine of stratigraphic continuity to be correct. He expected Lapworth to be deluded. Well, he got to this outcrop and he instantly changed his mind, and you can see why. It's kind of obvious. He recants almost instantly the Murchison doctrine and then takes credit for having discovered the contact, and publishes within a few weeks of seeing these outcrops in the journal Nature, writing this: when a geologist finds gneiss overlying gently inclined sheets of fossiliferous quartzite, shale and limestone, he may be excused if he begins to wonder whether he himself is not really standing on his head. Well, he's clearly done an about turn and stood on his own head in terms of trying to take credit for this outcrop. It caused enormous amounts of argument between the Geological Survey and the other geologists in the community. And you can understand why. So into the scene, Ben Peach, John Horne, and their colleagues of the Geological Survey, who take on the mantle of Ascension and of Charles Lapworth and Charles Callaway, and apply mapping to establish the geological structure, commissioned by Geekie. So they're Geekie's best team. Here they are. We might introduce them again from the photograph and in a couple of sketches by their colleague Henry Cadell, showing these characters as they went into the field. And here's some of the material that they generated. This is a coloured up geological map from the 1890s. It's hand coloured. It shows the quality of the mapping, but only a part of it through that region. Let's go and have a look at some of their field data. So here we are out on the west coast. It's an area called Laxford, and you can see this area of gneisses that are in the foreground, and here's part of their field mapping that they did on that ground. Exceptionally detailed. That field slip is about 1,500 metres top to bottom across there, so really detailed, mapping out lots of granite sheets in the red and various other intrusions. But it's within the thrust stacking areas that Peach and Horne really made their name. So this is some examples of one little area around the Hotel of Inch-le-Damp where they based themselves, of some of the fieldwork they did in the early part of the 1880s. So here's a field slip, lots of detail on it. They made all their decisions about where all the boundaries went in the field. That scene is about 1,500 metres square. The field maps were then compiled into things they called clean copies. Here's the clean copy of that same area, which is slightly more simplified and synthesized, but showing how the boundaries work. These maps are at 1 to 10,560 or 6 inches to the mile. They were then synthesized down again to a scale of 1 inch to the mile, and then published like that. So here's part of the published map that results from that. It's simplified, but it still shows enormously complicated structures. And they drew cross-sections. This is a cross-section that they published in 1888, just a few years into their investigations in this area around Inch-le-Damp. And what you can see on this cross-section is the stratigraphy. Each rock unit is given its own number, and you can see it repeated again and again and again and again by lots of faults, some of them low angle, some of them steep, creating a whole pile of thrust stacks. When you see sections like this, it's quite remarkable to think that some people in Murchison, when he went there, thought it was simple stratigraphy. So let's look at how that works. Here's Geekie's map from 1876, based on compiling spot visits to a few places and joining up the dots, and the dots were joined up not in the field but back in Edinburgh when they put the map together. So there's that map before the Highlands controversy. After it was resolved, this is what Geekie's map from 1892, after his colleagues had done some mapping. It's more detailed. It shows, particularly on this map, the stripy intrusions out in the gneisses on the west side of the map. Before the Highlands controversy, here's the Murchison cross section showing continuous stratigraphy. It's folded, but it's still continuous stratigraphy. And afterwards, a detailed part of it sliced up by stacks of thrust slices. So what was once stratigraphy, now considered to be complicated structure. So the survey won the game in the end. They published this spectacular geological map, and others as well, but it's the Ascent sheet published in 1921, which is the so-called special sheet, which is a remarkable document. They published most of their findings in the 1907 memoir, which became almost a textbook of structural geology in the day. The 1921 map includes these stunning cross-sections showing structural variation through the region. Their cross-sections you can still interpret today. Here they go. Look at that detail, look at that complexity. All arising from really careful mapping on good base maps at a good scale. And they didn't confine themselves to the thrust belt. They also looked at the gneissic areas. So here's part of an area around Gel, and it shows really complicated structure and picked out by these amphibolites in green through the pink gneisses, picking out folds and shear zones that you can still interpret today. The understanding from the thrust belts, what really caught the imagination, they were incorporated into textbooks in the day and became the definitive way of understanding how thrust tectonics works, and was applied the world over. So the work from Peach and Horn that Geekie commissioned became hugely important from the start of the 20th century, and it remained so pretty much through until the 1980s. So the 1921 map is still used for teaching today. I use it for teaching. It's a great map. It's a fantastic resource. So that history, a potted history of how knowledge was gained from the Northwest Highlands, it's one of argument, and it's the arguments and challenge that's led to the new knowledge of thrust tectonics. It's involved a whole series of people, so no one person can claim to have resolved the geology up there. Nicol built on McCulloch's map. Nicol established the idea the section was faulted. Murchison and Geekie went back to a simple stratigraphic succession, but in doing so created so much antagonism that it encouraged Callaway and Lapworth to go in and actually demonstrate that their area was faulted. Geekie lost that argument, but then applied and changed his mind and used the resources of the Geological Survey, Peach Horn and colleagues, to go and then create that map that we've been looking at in the last few pictures. So the heroes really are Lapworth, Callaway to an extent, but Lapworth and Peach and Horn. And the reason for that is that they applied the correct technology. The technology they applied was geological mapping. It was the idea of tracing boundaries out to try and understand the structure in 3 dimensions. And when you've got that, you can understand how it works. So you add another dimension, time, to understand how the rock sequences came to be as they were. The general point is that ideas evolve, and they evolve through the challenge of debate. You can find out more about this area and about the Highlands controversy in David Oldroyd's spectacular book, The Highlands Controversy, if you can still get a copy. Otherwise, there are 2 Geological Society special publications that cover a lot of the investigation history